Well, joining us for more on this conversation, we're joined, this is in particular the differing views of those that were part of the conference. We're joined by Wits School of Governance, Professor Themba Maseko. In a moment, we'll also bring in social justice activist Busi Seabe. Professor Maseko, good evening to you. Thanks for your time. So
Good evening, Kathy, and to your listeners.
Quite a lot to kind of try and reflect on coming out of this policy conference. But let's kick it off with this issue of accountability and what that looks like in the ANC going forward. This idea of an organization trying to renew itself and yet faced with very serious burning issues like what happens to its members that have been fingered in the Zondo report? What happens to the president who's facing an incredible scandal over this robbery at his farm?
Thanks, Kathy, for the question. And as I said, good evening to you and to your viewers rather than listeners. Look, I think the ANC is facing real challenges. They start with the whole policy conference to modernize the process in which it reviews, develops policy, because at the core of it, in my view, there needs to be extensive research done before such a conference. There needs to be monitoring evaluation to check the extent to which it has succeeded in implementing previous policies. How successful were they as a party to implement policies that they've adopted in the past? And therefore, there's a need for the party to find better ways of making sure that it prepares thoroughly for these conferences so that when they get together, it's not just policies that are taken off the cuff. There needs to be proper detailed research, investigation to make sure that they make the right policies that will enable them to address the challenges facing the country. Coming to your question, I think that the issue of accountability is obviously the most important thing. And I think that the ANC is beginning to realize that, in fact, the voters, the electorate, are watching, and they knew that if they were to take a decision to reverse their step-aside policy, incomplete as it is, it would have sent a very bad signal to the citizens, the voters in particular, because it would have meant that the ANC as a party is not realizing that citizens are concerned about issues of poor service delivery, they are concerned about corruption, and that there is no accountability. Those who have been fingered in allegations of corruption have not been held accountable. So taking a decision to reverse the policy of stepping aside would have sent a terrible signal to the voters out there. And I think that's the reason why the conference decided not to review that position. So they are becoming alive to the reality that the citizens are prepared to vote with their feet and actually send a very clear signal to the ANC that corruption is unacceptable. So I think that it is a smart move on the part of the conference not to reverse that particular resolution.
When you look at how many policy decisions that have been previously taken have been reaffirmed by this conference, one could almost say that this policy conference served the purpose of reviewing ANC policy rather than perhaps developing new kinds of responses to the challenges that South Africa is facing.
That's the challenge, and I think that's how the nation will measure the success or failure of such a conference, because there are real challenges that South Africans are worried about as we're sitting here, issues of poverty, unemployment, the issue of violent crime. I mean, we know what happened to our women in Krugersdorp over the weekend, where more than 12 women were brutally raped. So issues of crime, issues of unemployment, issues of poverty, the fact that millions of South Africans go to bed hungry are important issues uppermost in the minds of citizens. So the extent to which this policy was alive to the real concerns of citizens is how this party will be measured. Yes, the party is celebrating that this was a peaceful conference, there's no heckling and booing of speakers, etc., but the citizens aren't worried about it. They're worried about whether the policy conference is going to be able to take the country forward. And I think the jury is still out on that, because obviously we've not seen the final documents that would have come out of this conference. When we look at those resolutions, we're going to be judging them on the basis of their responsiveness to the challenges that are facing the nation. And as I say, I think the jury is still out whether they were able to do that. And a lot of it, in my view, has to do with the fact that the ANC needs to spend a little bit more time doing preparatory work before a policy conference of this nature, doing research, looking at data of where we are as a country since 1994. What changes have we made that would make the difference in the lives of ordinary people? And that, in my view, has a lot to do with the research that needs to be done, but also listening to the concerns of citizens out there. And when that is done, a policy conference then comes in and says, yes, we fully understand there are challenges facing our nation. This is what we have tried to do in the past. This is how we have succeeded in implementing some of the policies, but what new policies do we need to put in place to revive the economy, create jobs, look after our young people, make sure that there's safety and security in the country? So it's a much more complex process of policy making, but also making sure that they have tools that they can put in place to measure, monitor implementation of those policies so that we can begin to have a sense that they're taking the country forward. At this stage, I think that the jury is still out whether this conference has succeeded in doing that.
Let me bring into this conversation social justice activist Busi Seabe. Busi, good evening. Your own reflections on this weekend's policy conference, and again, just that question, is what is being dealt with, what has come out of the conference, a clear response and a viable response to the challenges facing South Africa?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It must be noted that the kinds of resolutions that came out of this policy conference are exactly the same as the resolutions from the 2017 December conference of the ANC, especially also when you look at the energy, policy that he spoke about so highly. It was a policy of 1998. So what we're seeing is a re-emergence, or rather regurgitation, of former policies of the ANC re-emerging now, because ultimately we have to come to an understanding that the ANC might not have new ideas on how to handle the kind of challenges we're faced with in society now. I mean, when we speak about GBV and femicide, this is something that the ANC Women's League should be leading. And when you look at the policy perspective and the positionality that they're taking now, you begin to understand that even the Women's League does not know how to approach this particular incident or this particular matter in the country. And this is very worrying. This is worrying because it is not necessarily only the responsibility of the top six in the ANC or the leadership of the ANC, but it's also the responsibility of the branches. So this begs the question as to, do the branches particularly understand what the ANC is trying to achieve? Do they agree with the objectives that the ANC has set out? And what are they willing to do to implement a lot of the policy objectives that they have? And I think there's a disjuncture between the leadership of the ANC and the branches. Because although we want to blame the leadership of the ANC for a lot of what is happening in the country, largely implementation happens at branch level. And if branches aren't coming to the table and aren't supporting what the leadership is trying to steer the organization into, then we're having a disjuncture. And this is what we're seeing in society, where people aren't able to relate to the current ANC because there is no effective communication. And more than anything else, there is no strategic, concrete plan.
Of course, the Women's League wouldn't be happy with that reflection. Yesterday, coming out of that social transformation committee, Lindiwe Sisulu saying that they spent 3 hours deliberating on this issue. 2 hours was on gender-based violence and the proposals of the Women's League on how to then deal with gender-based violence. What did you make of some of the solutions that they put on the table?
I mean, some of the solutions are, like I said, there's a copy and paste thing going on with the ANC at the moment. It could be out of sheer laziness. It could be out of the fact that they don't have new ideas. But
could it be that they believe the original plans are really that good, that all that needs to happen is for them to be implemented?
I mean, that would be great. That is us believing in, the work of the ANC. But more than anything else, the resolutions that came out of that particular committee are the resolutions that came out of the National GBV Summit that we had in Pretoria 2 years ago. So you begin to ask yourself, do they actually have ideas? Are they intellectually engaging one another? But more than anything else, are they engaging stakeholders in society? Are they engaging people on the ground who have to deal with the after effects of GBV in implementing or in drafting these policy resolutions? I think one thing that the ANC Women's League failed to do is to take the Young Women's Desk. They have an amazing desk called the Young Women's Desk. They should have taken the Young Women's Desk into their confidence and brought them in to that particular committee to lead that discussion, because I believe the Young Women's Desk has a more fresh, more vibrant, more direct kind of policy positioning with regards to GBV and femicide, and one that young people are willing to rally behind. But unfortunately, because the old guard is still there and still gatekeeping to a large extent, we aren't seeing a lot of progression from that perspective.
Themba, let me come to you very briefly. This idea of an old guard, of course, we heard now age 65 as a proposed number for retirements across the board. How do you think that's going to fly? I mean, there's no question about the fact that we need a lot more young ideas coming into the organization.
It's fresh ideas that are required. And part of the challenge that we're facing as a country is that because of the controversies surrounding politics, we're finding that smart, young, highly educated young people are getting alienated from politics because they associate politics with corruptions and incompetence, poor service delivery. So we're failing as a nation to begin to attract skilled, intelligent, smart people into political structures, not just the ANC, all of the parties. So that's why, in my view, we got to rethink the process of making policy. That is not a question of just young people sitting in a room and having a discussion. You've got to begin to rely on actual data and research to say what is happening in our country, listening to people, but importantly, doing detailed analysis, study, research, looking at what the data is telling us about what's happening in our nation, so that when we reach the stage of developing policy, you're basing that on actual data that you have at your disposal. And when you do that, you increase the chances of making sure that the policy recommendations you make are actually addressing the challenges that are facing the nation. And I'm a fan of getting young people involved in this policy-making process. And I think that the ANC and all political parties need to do more to invest in young people, giving them the skills of what it means to make policy, and then spending more time thinking about how those policies get implemented. Is government ready? Because one of the things I've seen coming out of this conference, for example, is the extent to which the state has the capacity to implement any of the policies that are coming out here. So it may very well be that as they do research, they will find that there needs to be major changes in the way government departments are organized, structured, the way they operate, and they're actually not capable of implementing these policies. And therefore, changes need to be put in place even within the state to make sure that you build capacity to implement these policies. So I know that there's often talk that the problem in this country is not policies, implementation. But I think that we have a lot of challenges about the way in which policies are developed, and therefore problems with the way in which they're implemented. There isn't enough system to monitor and evaluate policy implementation. And yes, young people will bring energy, will bring ideas, but we've got to fix the policy-making process and making sure that we come up with policies that will take our nation forward. At this stage, I don't think we're there yet. We believe in just sitting in meetings and thinking out ideas without doing proper background research to support the decisions we want to make.
And that's a really important point, that any good policy is as good as the ability to be able to implement it and to bring it to life. So, Busi, you know, the ANC looks at 40-year-olds and calls it the 40-year-olds, the young people of the organization, right? So when we think about how to revive an organization like that through the ideas of young people, do you think that the current leadership of the ANC is creating the same kind of opportunities that they were given at their age, and the opportunity to lead as young people when they were brought into the movement?
I would say definitely not. There's gatekeeping with regards to particular, not necessarily positions, because I've always believed that in order to effect tangible change, you don't necessarily need a fixed position, but you need to be able to have access to administration, governance, and resources. And I think young people aren't being given the opportunity to access resources that will help them to implement a lot of the change that they want to see. To a large extent, we're not relying just heavily on government as well, but we are willing to do the work that we think needs to happen in our society. There's a famous quote that says, you need to be the change that you want to see in society. And this generation of young people, I think through Fees Must Fall, has shown you that they are more than willing to stand up and physically do the work that will tangibly lead to some results. But unfortunately, we don't have access to resources. When you look at the NYDA, for an example, which is supposed to be funding, young people's projects, that's supposed to be facilitating some sort of youth development, you begin to understand that there's a disjuncture between its intended purpose and the results that we're seeing on the ground. And this is why, the proposition of a youth ministry that came out of, this conference was absolutely ridiculous, because if you're having a youth ministry, what then becomes, the point of the NYDA and other youth structures and NGOs that we have in society. So there seems to be a disjuncture between what is needed, and I think I do agree with the fact that there has to be a lot of research and data that goes into understanding what exactly needs to go into policy. But even if we do the research, even if we do get the data, the problem will be implementation. And unfortunately, the old guard does not have the energy, the vigor, and they don't have the vision for the country that young people do at the moment. So there needs to be a balance, and unfortunately, we're not seeing that yet in the ANC.
Social activist Busi, Seabe, and Wits School of Governance Professor Themba Maseko will leave it there for tonight. I'm back with more news after this.